Imagine this. If one day, an attack doesn't directly target NATO, but instead strikes the interests, soldiers, or bases of a member state, what would happen next? Would it be just a regional incident? Or would it be the moment that triggers a chain reaction that the whole world can't stop? History shows that military alliances don't go to war because they want to. They go because of duty, commitment, and sometimes, because they have no other choice. And the biggest question now is, if NATO is drawn into an escalating conflict, would it still be a regional war, or would it be a turning point that reshapes the global order? Expanding this picture to a deeper level, we see that the problem lies not only in airstrikes or harsh statements in international media, but in the already fragile structure of global security. For years, Europe has tried to maintain a balance between supporting the US, its long-standing strategic ally, and maintaining a space for dialogue with Iran to protect its economic, energy, and regional stability interests. But as military tensions escalate rapidly, that neutral space is shrinking day by day. The reality is that Britain, France, and Germany cannot simply declare abandoning when they have troops, logistical bases, warships, and citizens present throughout the Middle East. Vital shipping lanes like the Strait of Hormuz and the Suez Canal are vital to the European economy, especially given the continued sensitivity of global energy prices and inflation. An escalating conflict between the US and Iran would mean the risk of disrupting oil and gas supplies, a threat that Berlin, Paris, and London cannot afford to ignore. Therefore, their increased defenses are not merely political moves, but strategic responses aimed at protecting their own economic security. Beyond economic factors, there is also the alliance element. The US remains a cornerstone of the Western security structure, and NATO is the foundation binding European countries to Washington. Even if the conflict doesn't occur on European territory, any attack on US forces with a joint presence with British, French, or German troops could trigger collective defense mechanisms. This creates a dangerous vicious cycle. Iran might interpret European defensive support as an act of war, while Europe might view it as an obligation to protect its allies and soldiers. This divergence in interpretation could become the spark for unintended escalation. Another less discussed aspect is internal political pressure. In Britain, any threat to British bases or citizens abroad immediately becomes a national security issue, forcing the government to react strongly to maintain its prestige. In France, a tradition of strategic independence means Paris does not want to be seen as following Washington. But at the same time, it cannot ignore its defense obligations and geopolitical interests in the Middle East. Germany, with its sensitive history of militarization, usually chooses a more cautious approach. But even Berlin has to reconsider its position when European security is directly threatened. What complicates the situation further is the role of other major powers. Russia and China are closely monitoring every move of the West. If Europe becomes deeply involved in the conflict in the Middle East, it could be diverted from other fronts, particularly Eastern Europe. This raises a strategic question. Does Europe have the capacity to maintain stability on multiple fronts simultaneously? And if it has to choose, which regional security will it prioritize? From a strategic psychological perspective, the most worrying aspect is the feeling of no choice. Initially, European countries may believe they still retain a mediating role, but as attacks and retaliations occur repeatedly, as air defense systems are activated, and as warships are deployed to sensitive waters, the reality becomes that they have already stepped one foot into the conflict. Whether called defense or deterrence, increased military presence alters the balance of power and perceptions of the parties involved. On a broader level, Europe's involvement in a war between the US and Iran could reshape the international order. The world is already in a transition from a unipolar to a multipolar model. With multiple competing centers of power, an expanded confrontation could accelerate polarization, forcing other nations to choose sides or arm themselves for self-defense. The conflict would then cease to be a bilateral issue and become a test of the entire global security structure. Ultimately, the biggest question isn't whether Britain, France, and Germany will officially declare war, but rather the extent to which they can control their involvement. History shows that many major wars don't begin with the intention of globalizing conflict, but with a series of small decisions, each seemingly logical at the time. If the escalation continues, Europe may realize that it is no longer in the position of observer or mediator. but has become an integral part of the confrontation. And when that happens, the world will enter a new phase of instability, where the lines between defense and engagement blur, and the risk of contagion is greater than ever. A closer look at this transitional period reveals that Europe moved from a position of observation and calls for restraint to a state of active defensive preparation in a very short time. Initially, the diplomatic statements of Britain, France, and Germany were balanced. They affirmed the Allies' right to self-defense while emphasizing the need to avoid escalation and reopen channels of negotiation. However, as Iran's retaliatory actions expanded in scope and approached areas with European military presence, the strategic calculations shifted dramatically. No country could ignore the risk of its soldiers or citizens becoming unintended targets. The activation of air defense systems, increased naval patrols, and deployment of additional forces to hotspots were not merely technical actions, but also a political message. Europe would not allow itself to be put in a passive position. When a joint base with the US has to raise its alert level, when warships have to shift from training missions to combat readiness, the line between non-combat and indirect involvement begins to blur. In a complex security environment like the Middle East, even a small miscalculation can lead to an uncontrollable chain reaction. Another factor pulling Europe further away from its safe zone is its interwoven network of alliances. The UK is a close military ally of the US. France maintains its role as an influential power in the Mediterranean and the Gulf, and Germany, despite its caution, remains closely tied to the NATO structure. When one link in the system is affected, the others can hardly remain uninvolved. This creates a dilemma. If they react strongly to protect their interests, they may be seen as escalating. If they react weakly, they risk losing credibility and deterrence. Furthermore, domestic public opinion also plays a crucial role. Images of missiles flying over areas with European troops, or information about threats to citizens, immediately put pressure on governments to act. In a global media landscape where information is disseminated in real time, the space for discreet negotiations is significantly reduced. Leaders must ensure security while avoiding the impression that they are rushing into an unnecessary war. All these factors suggest that the process of being drawn in is not a single decision, but a series of small steps accumulating over time. From diplomacy to defense, from defense to deterrence, and from deterrence potentially leading to direct confrontation if retaliatory measures continue to escalate. Europe may not have officially entered the war, but it has crossed the line of absolute neutrality, and it is this subtle shift that signals the conflict spiraling far more widely than initially anticipated. Delving deeper into the defensive measures aspect, the core issue lies in defining what constitutes defense and what constitutes combat. In the modern conflict environment, the lines between these two concepts are increasingly blurred. When a nation deploys additional air defense systems, increases its escort warships, or places its forces on high alert, it may consider these actions purely defensive. However, from the adversary's perspective, these moves are perceived as preparation for deeper intervention. This difference in interpretation increases the risk of strategic misunderstanding. For Europe, particularly the UK, France, and Germany, the issue is not just about protecting bases or troops, but also about protecting prestige and deterrence. If a shared base with the US is attacked without a commensurate response, the message sent would be a weakening of collective security commitment. This could set a dangerous precedent, encouraging further provocations. Therefore, the declaration of readiness to take necessary and proportionate measures carries both military and political significance. It aims to prevent escalation by demonstrating resolve, but at the same time carries the risk of being drawn deeper into a spiral of confrontation. A noteworthy element is NATO's collective defense mechanism, when the alliance affirms that it will defend all members against a threat. That message creates a psychological shield for member states. However, it also means that any incident involving European forces in the Middle East could be elevated to a common security issue. If an attack causes significant casualties among British or French soldiers, the pressure to activate the collective response mechanism will increase sharply. In that context, the response could go beyond on-site defense and become a broader campaign to neutralize the source of the threat. Furthermore, the concept of modern defense goes beyond simply intercepting missiles in the air. It can include preemptive strikes against launch sites, command systems, or logistical facilities used by the enemy to launch attacks. From a military perspective, This is seen as a way to minimize the risk to one's own forces. However, politically, such action could easily be perceived as a shift from defensive to offensive. This intersection creates a dilemma for Europe. If it doesn't act strongly enough, it may continue to be threatened. If it acts too strongly, it may officially be drawn into war. In the long term, Europe's strategy will likely be based on two parallel pillars: maintaining strong defensive capabilities for deterrence and expanding diplomatic channels to de-escalate tensions. However, balancing these two goals requires close coordination between European capitals and Washington, as well as the ability to control the messages sent outward. A single overly harsh statement or ill-considered military action can alter perceptions and push the situation off the desired trajectory. And once that threshold is crossed, returning to neutrality becomes almost impossible. A closer look at Tehran's tough rhetoric reveals that it's not merely a diplomatic warning, but a carefully calculated deterrence strategy. When Iran declares that any nation engaging in military action against it will be considered a direct adversary, the message aims to amplify the political cost of intervention. In other words, Tehran wants to transform military action from a decision to support an ally into a risky choice for the nation's own territory and security. This strategy has two clear objectives. First, it seeks to divide the Western alliance by prompting European countries to question whether protecting American interests is worth the risk of being targeted. Second, it signals to domestic public opinion in Britain, France, and Germany that military intervention could have direct consequences for their citizens. In a European society already sensitive to prolonged wars following experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, this message could exert significant pressure on governments. However, Iran's warning also presents a strategic paradox. If Europe completely backs down to avoid being seen as a belligerent, it could inadvertently weaken collective deterrence and set a precedent that threats can force them to retreat. Conversely, if it demonstrates resolve by increasing its military presence and coordinating closely with the US, it risks confirming Tehran's argument that the West is forming a common front against Iran. Both options carry significant risks. What complicates the situation is the modern nature of warfare, where not only traditional airstrikes exist, but also cyber attacks, proxy wars, and indirect retaliations through allied forces in the region. A cyber attack on a European nation's energy or financial infrastructure, while not physically destructive, can still have far-reaching psychological and economic consequences. In that scenario, defining what constitutes an act of war becomes more ambiguous than ever. Psychologically, Iran's warning also aims to create uncertainty. When a nation cannot accurately predict the extent and form of retaliation it might face, it tends to be more cautious in its decisions. This is part of the art of deterrence, not necessarily immediate action. Just making the opponent believe you are ready and able to do so. For Europe, the challenge lies in maintaining the delicate balance between deterrence and restraint. They must demonstrate that they are not intimidated by tough rhetoric, but at the same time, they must not push the situation beyond a point of no return. In this context, every diplomatic statement, every military deployment, and every strategic decision carries more weight than usual. And it is this tension between resolve and caution that will shape how Europe responds to the warning that any nation that engages in conflict will become a target. Beneath the surface of tough diplomatic pronouncements, the scenario of Europe being drawn into a direct war is essentially a gradual escalation, not a sudden decision to engage. Initially, countries like Britain, France, or Germany might simply condemn the attacks, call for restraint, and promote diplomatic solutions. But when military bases housing European troops in the region are threatened by missiles or UAVs, the issue shifts from political stance to a practical security question: how to protect one's own people. It is at this point that the line between defense and engagement begins to blur. An air defense system deployed to protect a base could be seen by Iran as part of a military structure against them. A European warship escorting a merchant ship through the Strait of Hormuz could be seen as strategic support for the United States. And if an attack targeting European forces results in casualties, domestic political pressure will force governments to react, however much they may wish to remain neutral. More dangerously, modern warfare isn't limited to the skies or offshore. Cyber attacks on power lines, banks, or transportation systems can cripple a nation without firing a single bullet. If Europe is targeted in this way, It will have to determine whether it constitutes an act of war. And if the answer is yes, what will the response be? Economic sanctions, retaliatory cyber attacks, or limited military action? Each option carries the risk of escalating the conflict to a new level. Another factor complicating the situation is the alliance mechanism. If one member is attacked, the remaining countries will have to consider their obligation to provide support. This could turn a regional incident into a collective problem. Meanwhile, Iran could continue to assert that it is only responding to what it considers hostile acts, thereby reinforcing its domestic argument that it is acting in self-defense rather than initiating war. The most worrying aspect of this scenario is not a major decision announced on television, but a series of small steps, each seemingly logical and necessary at the time. An additional defense system, a limited airstrike to deter, a new round of sanctions. All of these gradually create a new reality where Europe is no longer an observer or mediator, but has become a direct party to the conflict. Therefore, when we say that Europe is being dragged into war, it doesn't necessarily mean they are actively choosing that path. Sometimes, involvement in war is the result of security commitments, forced responses, and miscalculations that accumulate over time. And in the current climate of tension, it is precisely this accumulation of factors that worries many analysts the most. As tensions escalate, NATO will face a crucial question: which front should resources be prioritized? With Europe already allocating budgets and military capabilities to its eastern flank, opening another hotspot in the Middle East could create unprecedented strategic pressure. If countries like the UK, France, and Germany are forced to increase their military presence in the Gulf region, they may be compelled to readjust their commitments elsewhere, inadvertently creating a vacuum for other powers to exploit. Alongside the military aspect is the ripple effect of economic repercussions. The Strait of Hormuz and the Suez Canal are not merely shipping lanes, they are the lifeblood of global trade. A series of attacks on oil tankers or a surge in war insurance premiums could cause energy prices in Europe to skyrocket. This would not only increase inflation but also put pressure on governments already grappling with post-pandemic economic instability and the previous energy crisis. A new crisis could undermine growth, destabilize financial markets, and push consumer confidence to dangerously low levels. Domestically, public reaction will be crucial. European societies are currently wary of prolonged military interventions. If casualties occur or economic costs become too apparent, anti-war movements and opposition parties could exploit the situation to increase political pressure. This could easily lead to deep internal divisions, even shaking ruling coalitions. A government weakened by a crisis of confidence will struggle to maintain a long-term military commitment. The strategic psychological factor cannot be ignored when multiple countries are drawn into a spiral of escalation. The risk of miscalculation increases exponentially. A defensive action could be interpreted as an attack. A deterrent could be seen as preparation for a larger-scale campaign. In that environment, even a minor incident, a downed aircraft, a warship collision, a network outage, can become the catalyst for a chain reaction spiraling out of control. In short, this scenario is not just a story of an escalating regional conflict, but a test of the crisis management capabilities of global alliances. Without effective dialogue mechanisms and emergency communication channels, escalation can become a self-sustaining process, where each side acts out of fear of strategic fall behind. And it is in this accumulation of small decisions, defensive calculations, and forced responses that the risk of alliance fractures and global escalation truly becomes alarming. As the picture broadens, the real concern is not just the potential for a multilateral war, but the world entering a phase where the lines between regional conflict and global war are increasingly blurred. In this scenario, the US and Iran might be the initial focal points of confrontation, but overlapping alliances, energy interests, and security commitments mean any escalation risks spiraling out of control. Britain, France, and Germany may not desire a war, but as strategic interests, international prestige, and allied obligations are weighed against each other, neutrality becomes an increasingly difficult option to maintain. Another crucial factor is the shift in the nature of global power. The world is no longer a unipolar structure, but a multipolar environment with multiple centers of influence. This means that any major confrontation could become a test of strength between different power blocks. If Europe is drawn deeper into conflict, other major powers will have to adjust their strategies. possibly by increasing their military presence in the region, expanding security cooperation, or leveraging the situation to consolidate their positions. This shift could alter the global balance of power for years to come. Beyond geopolitical factors is the risk of spillover effects to non-traditional fronts. The 21st century has seen the rise of information warfare, cyber attacks, and public opinion manipulation. A military crisis could be accompanied by waves of fake news, propaganda campaigns, and attacks on digital infrastructure. As social trust erodes and polarization increases, the ability to maintain national consensus on foreign policy diminishes. This makes crisis management more difficult than ever. At the economic level, global markets are extremely sensitive to instability. Soaring oil prices, disrupted supply chains, and stalled investment flows could trigger a new wave of recession. Economies dependent on energy exports or imports of strategic raw materials will be directly impacted. As fiscal pressure mounts, governments must weigh defense spending against domestic economic stability, a dilemma with no easy solution. All these factors converge into a thought-provoking reality: a war, if it breaks out, will no longer be confined to geography or military spheres. It will be a comprehensive test of the international system, encompassing security, economics, society, and technology. And in today's highly interconnected world, every decision made in a capital city can create a domino effect globally. Therefore, the greatest risk lies not only in firepower, but in the possibility of misjudging each other's intentions and being drawn into an uncontrollable escalation.